Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is the anonymously titled The Black Horse. He's a Canadian professional, and in this conversation we talk about Canadian identity, specifically from the point of view of the elite and the development of Canada as a nation, historically, and then in the Trudeau era, both senior Trudeau and then the present or the outgoing Trudeau. Fascinating discussion. I believe and have believed for a while that Canada is a petri dish in which we can view the end game of progressivism and post-liberalism in the left direction, and understanding how it's working out and what the consequences are is, well, it's not good for Canada, but it's good for us who can learn from it. If you're interested in more of The Black Horse, you can find links to his work down there in the description. And if you enjoy this content, consider supporting me via the links below. Without further ado, here is The Black Horse. I hope you're cozy.
Yeah, it's it's like minus 30 today here, so it's
Jeez.
it's a cozy day.
Wait, did you convert to
No,
Fahrenheit for me? Or?
that's Celsius.
Jeez.
To convert to American, that's only like minus 8 or 9. So
Okay.
there
Well,
you
that's
go.
still, yeah. Wow. Chilly, frosty. Have you always been that far removed from nice weather?
Yeah, I was born and raised within 100 miles of where I live now.
Oh, wow. Huh.
So
Has
and
that shaped you think? Your
uh
political point of view for the
yes.
better?
Well, so not only was I born and raised within 100 miles of where I currently live, at least 9 generations of my family were born and raised in this spot. Probably
Oh,
every generation since 1780.
wow.
So,
Wow.
uh, probably my earliest uh, relatives not from this spot are like late 19th century, mid 19th century.
Wow.
So,
What's the attrition rate, you think, across the generations, people fleeing, going to the
uh,
city?
not very high to this point. Um, the attrition rate was extreme in the has been extreme because of the antinatalism of progressivism.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure I really want to go into this part of my personal history
Yeah.
on the show, but broadly speaking, I come from the group of people from which I'm descended became highly progressive in the 19th century. And the consequence of that high degree of progressivism has been a collapse in the post boomer generations, just due to poor fertility and due to um, the really negative outcomes associated with progressivism.
Hmm.
Observing this in my own sort of social circles
Yeah.
and my own familial circles uh, is kind of where I came. One of the first ideas that I brought forward in this space, I introduced as a concept which referred to progressivism as a kind of genetic bottleneck. And that very much comes out of my own experience. You can later find it in the data, but it certainly came out of my experience before I saw it in the data,
Hmm.
because the attrition rate due to just like absolutely insane life choices promoted by progressivism generationally in the Canadian elite is very extreme,
Hmm.
and very new. Most Canadian elite families have long histories prior to the 90s in this country,
Yeah.
and a very large number of them will drop out of the Canadian elite in this generational cycle.
Uh, just because they're tired of it, or because they can't achieve elite status, or why would they drop out
Well, either
of
because they didn't
status?
have any children,
Oh.
or because the children that they had have like 8 mental disorders,
Oh.
or because the children that they have are addicted to porn and video games and don't do anything. um, or because the children that they have are like Justin Trudeau, but with less cushion between them and the plebs.
Yeah.
Um, so the kind of progressive culture into which they raise these children, um, beginning with kind of maybe here boomers and Gen X, um, is extremely antenatal and extremely antithetical to the behaviors that perpetuate elite status from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the attrition rate among the Canadian elite, that cohort and forward, is quite high.
So when we come to think of Canada, that MAIDS program, medical
Yep.
assistance in dying, is like a symptom of a suicide pact that predates it. It's a philosophical attitude that eventually gives rise to this
Well,
killing
yeah,
machine.
I mean, it's two things, right? Um, the philosophical perspective that led to it is also part of this bottleneck, right? Uh, the Canadian elite imbibes a very extreme form of liberalism, which exalts the individual self-expression as the highest virtue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if a person is either incapable of that individual self-expression or in pain, it sees killing that person as the logical and humane thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that element, but that marries elegantly to the other um,
Hmm.
important attitude that characterizes the Canadian elite, which is a kind of technocratic view. So you can both you can both allow maximum freedom of expression at the same time as coming up with a technocratically elegant way to reduce healthcare costs, and
Mm-hmm.
at the same time as, I mean, there's a sort of demographic self-extinguishing kind of attitude there as well,
Hmm.
right?
I interviewed Dimes,
Yep.
and him and his cohorts have created a video, very good documentary. I got to publish the interview. It's a little delayed right now, about Canadian immigration. We got into, the Canadian attitude. Why do you think that Canada has gone so far progressive? Similar, not identical, but similar to other British satellite states or
Yeah.
ex-colonies like New Zealand, and then the more progressive areas of Australia. Why are these territories the ones that have embraced and internalized and pushing this particular strain of suicidal dogma?
There's layers to that. The most obvious layer is that in Canada, sovereignty is held almost entirely within the formal government, whereas in the US, sovereignty is distributed quite broadly. Elon Musk is not in the formal government, but he's certainly a possessor of some share of sovereignty in the US. Um, Whoever owns the New York Times, I think it's the Salzburgers, are definitely in possession of some fraction of sovereignty in the US.
Okay.
Whereas in Canada, 100% of sovereignty resides within the government. You can see this in aspects of our formal constitution. We have something called the notwithstanding clause, which means that any and all of the rights contained in the constitution can be overridden if it's deemed that there's an overriding public interest at either the federal or provincial level.
Public interest.
Yeah,
That
so
is like the most Orwellian way to say state of exception.
yes. So we have a formal state of exception in our Constitution. We have a formal procedure, used to be called the War Measures Act. Now it's called the Emergencies Act,
Yeah.
in order to suspend all civil liberties and, essentially declare martial law when required. So there's that aspect where, unlike in the US, where the courts are maybe the final source of authority, but because they can't actively legislate, there really is some division of sovereignty between the courts, the legislature, and the executive.
Hmm.
In Canada, the courts are not sovereign in any respect because their decisions can be unilaterally overridden in any in a very wide number of cases and have been historically in
By
every
whom?
important case. Uh,
Who has the power?
by by either the provincial level of government or by the prime minister.
Okay.
And so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is the propaganda uh, machine is entirely operates almost entirely at the whim of the federal government in Canada, unlike the in the US, the direction of the propaganda machine is quite distributed. Um, but in Canada, we have CBC, which is formally state owned. And then we have a program where um, I think it currently sits at 35% of the salary of all journalists in the country at accredited institutions is paid by the federal government.
Hmm.
And the federal government has a long history of leveraging subsidies and leveraging access to the federal government against um, news outlets that are not part of the regime. So you'll hear Rebel News complain about this constantly
Yeah.
because they're not part of the establishment here. Um, so you really have a much higher degree of sovereignty concentrated within the federal government, which means that um, when a particular ideology comes down from the Canadian elite, it can come down very, very hard, and there's no brakes on that train particularly.
Hmm.
Um, so that's a big difference between Canada and very likely the other Anglo countries, though I'm a little less familiar with the constitutional structure of
Yeah.
Australia and New Zealand.
Well,
Um,
one would assume that this sort of centralized arrangement of sovereignty came out of conditions that made it favorable to do this, right? What were the conditions under which this made sense to do?
well, so this is, I mean, it's a basic difference in view as to where sovereignty rests. Uh,
Hmm.
Sovereignty in all the sort of in the British tradition always rests in the legislature and with the prime minister or the king, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And it rests there unequivocally and absolutely. Whereas in the French tradition, from which the American system is derived, sovereignty the idea is to divide sovereignty. And sovereignty is supposed to be in the courts in Lady Justice who's blind and all this other stuff, right?
Hmm.
And so that's one piece. The difference in the structure of the propaganda apparatus, I think, is primarily historical. Um, but the Canadian progressive state has been so strong for so long. I mean, the Liberal Party of Canada was in power in Canada more years in the 20th century than the Communist Party was in the Soviet Union. Um, and so that kind of monoculture among the Canadian elite um, fostered an environment where total control of the propaganda and education apparatus seemed desirable because you had a very unified elite. You didn't really have until the country started to break apart in the 70s. You really didn't have
Hmm.
any challenge to sovereignty. And so that's how the apparatus got assembled, and it's been
Hmm.
kind of running. It's been it it has gone through periods where it's looked like it's going to break down, and periods where it's been kind of put back together a couple of times since then. But it's kind of staggered on since it was assembled.
Hmm. Is there any sign of it changing orientations or dissolving? I mean, if it's strong enough to not dissolve, then it could still pivot.
Yeah, so there are Canada has real politics, unlike most countries in the Anglo world.
Hmm.
Uh, and those real politics are driven by regional interests. So
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
the traditional ruling class of Canada are, I refer to them, they're often referred to as the Laurentian elite. They represent sort of Canada big business. Their seat of power is in the corridor between Montreal and Toronto. Um, these are the people who, as their political vehicle, have the Liberal Party of Canada. But their mismanagement of the country, beginning with Trudeau Sr. in the 70s, has created a series of broken off regional elites that have
Hmm.
disparate interests and disparate political vehicles that form the actual check on power in Canada. So as a
Hmm.
result of the national energy policy in the 70s and subsequent friction, the western provinces of Canada ended up with a distinct elite class whose power and influence come from their ownership of oil and gas interests out there,
Mm-hmm.
um, and to a lesser extent, mining and agricultural interests. But because those interests are tied to the international market for those commodities, they're distinct from the sort of broader business interests that characterize the Laurentian elite. And they hold this deep grudge from the attempted nationalization of the energy industry in the 70s.
Okay.
And then on the other side, when Trudeau Sr. invoked the War Measures Act to try to break Quebec separatism in the 70s, he created a powerful and self-conscious French Canadian elite who, again, have a regional and ethnic interest, um, a, a base of power within the formal government, and a whole series of levers at their disposal. So Canada isn't ideologically fractured in the way that you might think of a state's politics being ideologically fractured. Instead, it's fractured on these regional economic interests.
Okay. So there's still basically kind of a Canadian, a broadly construed Canadian identity or vibe. Sorry to use that word.
Well, so
When you
I
say
would
ideology.
disagree. I would say that there's at least three distinct Canadian identities that are
Okay.
growing in strength, but they have all historically been progressive in their
Yeah.
sort of ideological politics.
So I'm just going to guess the French, Canadian, the liberals, and then the conservatives. They're all basically what
Yes,
we would term liberal. Yeah.
they're all progressives, but
Progressive. Okay.
they have uh, they have different ethnic and economic interests.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One of my favorite ways of representing this comes from an article in the Globe and Mail back in advance of one of the elections in the 50s that said um, the the conservatives believe in the welfare state from the cradle to the grave. The liberals believe in the welfare state from the womb to the tomb, and the NDP believe in the welfare state from conception to resurrection. Right, three distinct political parties with identical progressive credentials, but representing different
Yeah.
elite groups within the country.
So they all believe in the good government, the
Yeah,
good government. Yeah. The government is the provider of rights and safeties and all that.
yeah, they all come out of kind of the blue American conception of how government should operate. The long-standing slogan in Canada was peace, order, and good governance,
Yeah.
and they all had a unified conception of what that meant. They just have
They just put the
divergent,
goal markers.
yeah, they have divergent interests, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, could we dive a little bit into Trudeau Sr.'s reign? What was he after in nationalizing through the energy policy? Like, what was his, from your point of view, what was his intent
So
or ambition?
Trudeau Sr. Wanted to transform Canada into something like what Venezuela looks like today, where you have these large state-owned enterprises that finance the government not through tax revenue, but through revenue coming out of coming out of primary industries.
Hmm.
And so he wanted to nationalize the hydroelectric industry, and he wanted to nationalize the oil and gas industry. And the culmination of that vision would have been to nationalize the other primary resource industries in the country. Um, at the basic premise of this idea is to capture these kinds of windfall revenues inside the government rather than in private industry, and narrow the Canadian elite around the formal government rather than around the sort of broader merchant oligarchy that exists in the country.
Hmm. Are you favorable to that idea, or like, what's the pros and cons of that? Because I mean, it sounds kind of, you could just do a very easy, that's communist and stuff, but there's got to be trade-offs for that. If ideally, if it worked, it would work very well.
I mean, the so I would my point of view is that it would be fine, except that the people who tried to do it are kind of pure evil.
Damn it! If only they weren't evil.
So maybe that's always the case when that kind of project is undertaken.
Yeah.
I don't know, but anything that puts more power into the hands of that particular group of people
Yeah.
is something that I'm against.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, the other thing that I think about it is that the fact the project was abortive led to like a total breakdown in the unified governing consensus that bound the country together. So you still have
Sounds mythological. He overstepped on Mount Olympus and created the factions.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then Trudeau Jr. again,
Yeah.
like his father, invokes the War Measures Act, oversteps, and breaks down the Liberal coalition. And we've yet to see what all the long-term consequences of that will be. But Canada will. I'm not even sure that Canada as a nation, like as a single political entity, will survive it. So
You think?
well, we have Canada as a nation exists on a political formula that extracts wealth from Western Canada to bribe Quebec to stay in Confederation.
Yeah.
Right. And that formula, because Western Canada was punished during COVID, Western Canada tends to be more Christian, more conservative, was more kind of anti-lockdown.
They're
And
slightly
saw,
more individualistic, or still rather good governance and peace and prosperity?
it's good governance and peace and prosperity, but unlike the Laurentian elite, who are thoroughly post-Christian and hold kind of deep animosity towards Christians, the Western elite they're more where kind of red American elites are today, where maybe they're not authentically Christian, but they kind of,
Well, they're more Christian
their,
than Christian if you look at
yeah,
their ideological.
it's part of their identity in some way. And so when Trudeau, I have to be careful what I say because of the legal system in Canada. When Trudeau
Wow, sorry about that.
spoke to the public about the atrocities that occurred at certain residential schools, which are surrounded by fields of tree roots. Tree roots that have suspicious shapes, and then unleashed his guys to go and burn down and vandalize churches as a consequence. So that because
Hundreds of churches.
yes, because of course the problem when you send children to residential schools at the point of police guns is that those residential schools were sometimes run by churches. The problem can't be the progressive state that decided that residential schools were where you had to send your children.
Mm.
So we got to blame somebody for it. Might as well be the churches.
Yeah.
And so
They love
when
being
you,
martyrs anyways, so.
yeah, exactly. So when you do that, and you already have an underlying elite fracture, you create a whole. You under He undermined the formula. He set off Western Canadian separatism in a way that it just didn't exist before.
Okay.
And so, if you have separatism in the region that pays for everything, that's a big problem, and it's going to have to be addressed somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, the logical way to address it is to let the formal political representation of Western Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, take over the government for a while and kind of have Western Canada buy back in.
Yeah.
But if you do that, then you're gonna the other side in Quebec is gonna get upset by it. So I don't know whether they'll be able to put this back together again or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more likely than not that they will be able to put it back together, but I'm rooting for it not to happen. So, we all
Well,
have our prejudices.
so the Western Canada, rather more conservative, rather more Christian, produces material wealth for Canada.
Yes, enormous material wealth.
So what does Quebec and the Laurentian elite produce other than
Well,
elite capital? Is it
they
culture?
can. I mean, they control
Croissants?
the formal government. They control the propaganda apparatus, and they're an extractive body primarily. I mean,
Yeah.
in Quebec, they're blessed with an enormous natural hydroelectric resource that's all owned by the Quebec government. So they produce that.
Okay.
The Laurentian elite are also the inheritors of one of the most powerful banking cartels anywhere in the world with the five Canadian banks.
Okay, banking. All right.
Um, and the Canadian banks, the five Canadian banks, aren't just significant within Canada. Um, they have some of the largest franchises in the United States as well, and
Hmm.
they dominate parts of the Latin American market.
Oh, really?
So uh, they produce a great deal of revenue for the Canadian state.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least on paper or digits. Yeah.
Well, I mean, when it's banking revenue coming from one country to another, that's real
Okay.
inflows of cash, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any likelihood that somebody can pull a Steve Jobs on BlackBerry, like produce an iPhone of banking that would completely decimate the BlackBerry of Canadian banking? Just throwing that out there. It's a wild
I
idea.
mean, the financial industry is the most heavily guarded industry in the world via regulatory moats.
Yeah.
So you've seen this in the US where Robinhood attempted to enter the financial industry and was wiped out. Silicon Valley Bank attempted to enter the financial industry and was wiped out. Um, this has happened repeatedly. And through my entire lifetime, all you've seen is consolidation into the couple of global hubs of banking
Hmm.
where the banks happen to sit back to back with the central bank as well as the regulators. And far be it from me to suggest that there's any correlation between that, but
Yeah.
uh, it just so happens that the U.S. financial industry continues to centralize into Manhattan, and it just so happens that the Canadian financial industry continues to centralize rather than diversify.
So again, like with MAID, that debanking in the wake of the trucker convoy was actually an echo of power. Like that actually reveals a vector of power, or at least it was a flex that reflects back on a underlying reality of the power structure sovereignty in Canada.
Yes, but it was also in enormous error.
Was it?
Yes. So the effort to debank dissidents in Canada was the first thing that Trudeau did during COVID that began to fracture his own coalition. because if you think about what I just told you about the Canadian banks, they've got these large franchises internationally and especially in Latin America.
Huh.
Those franchises were reputationally damaged by debanking political dissidents in another country. So you think about the franchise for a bank like Scotia, which has a huge private banking, ultra high net worth franchise through Latin America. Think about what all those customers are going to think when you're canceling people's accounts for disagreeing with the government. Mm-hmm. Like they have their money in a foreign bank so that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. So because of that, because it was done, because it didn't work, Trudeau still had to do what virtually all governments end up having to do to deal with dissent. He still had to go and send the police to club the people. It created a huge degree of dissatisfaction from that element of the Laurentian elite with Trudeau. And it was the first of several fractures that eventually resulted in his political demise.
There's a guy we both know. Actually, I wouldn't say you work for him, but your content appears on his channel, Academic Agent. And I enjoy his content. He does these little snarky videos. Well, not snarky. I don't want to undermine him, but he's kind of brusque. I enjoy it. His character that he projects. And he said something about it's kind of midwit. It's a midwit tier endeavor to psychologize. You should just avoid psychology. But what's the psychology of Justin Trudeau? Does he feel embarrassment? Is there any there with regard to understanding failure and responsibility and accountability?
So Justin Trudeau I can speak to him because I grew up with many people who are just like Justin Trudeau.
This kind of person, this kind of people.
Yes, this kind of person.
Yeah.
There are a lot of them among the kind of this generation of the Canadian elite. And
fake, gay, and retarded.
Yeah, they're not serious people, really, but they end up with these very serious jobs because of the generational capital that was passed to them. Mm-hmm. And they struggle with how to handle that. You can see he's a very brittle individual.
Yeah.
He's vain, but I don't see shame there. Capacity for shame is something deeper. But no, capacity for shame would require an aspiration to kind of heroic greatness. Right? Why do you feel shame? You feel shame because you fell short of some higher ideal. There's no higher ideal there. There's just like an animal cunning that knows you're supposed to grab onto power. And there's no higher ideal there because these people never learned history. They have no. They're not even like most Americans who are atheists are either anti-Christians or anti-Jews, right? They may not believe in the traditions, but they grew up in their shadow. They understand them. Mm-hmm. Whereas because the decline of Christianity among the people from whom the Laurentians are descended happened in the progressive era in like 1920, these people didn't grow up in the shadow of Christianity in the same way. They don't even really understand the traditions of their forefathers. And so they've got their how do you even express this? They have no relationship with the transcendent or the historical. Yeah. They're just themselves in the moment.
If one reads Nietzsche and Nietzsche's the type of person that he most despises, the man at the end of history, the last man.
Yes.
Contextless, unheroic. It sounds like that's what you're describing.
Exactly. That's exactly the kind of man that Justin Trudeau is. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of man doesn't experience shame honor really at all.
Yeah. And how does that affect how he rules? I mean, I guess we can look at history, but from
Well,
just Canadian history, from
so there's a couple of things that it affects. First of all, it means that he doesn't understand his opponents.
hmm,
Um, so, like one of the great errors that the Canadian state made um, during lockdown, they ordered all the churches to shut down gatherings over 10 people for like very, very long stretches of time. And eventually this comes to a head. A couple of pastors get arrested. First, James Coates. James Coates is the first one. Tim Stevens after that. There are a bunch of other ones that were either threatened arrest or actually arrested, had their buildings confiscated, all this kind of stuff. So Justin Trudeau and the powers and the people like him who populate the Canadian state all figure that if they give these people a hard time, throw them in prison, that uh, it's going to result in them buckling.
hmm. They
Because
really don't know Christian history, do they?
Because Justin Trudeau would buckle, right?
Yeah, okay.
Right. Every one of them faced with a powerful disincentive. They don't have any relationship with the transcendent. They don't have any relationship with history. They don't see themselves in a story that way.
Hmm.
So they don't even understand why, like, it doesn't, they can't comprehend the logic that would lead somebody to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
It
they end
reminds
up
me of
in
what Trudeau said when he hired an all-female cabinet, and somebody asked him why. He said because it's 2020 or whatever. He said
2015. Yeah.
2018, 2015. He's current year. He's literally the memento of philosophies. Like he has all these instructions written on his body, but he has to piece it together at every
Yeah.
waking moment.
Yeah. And so, like, the Canadian elite have this problem where they don't understand people who aren't last men. And so every time they encounter them, they get surprised on how they act and make errors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, the, they use when the truck protest arrived in Ottawa during 2020 or sorry 2021, they use every fox tactic to disincentivize people from protesting they can think of. The one that everybody remembers is debanking, but they did everything from uh, banning fuel sales so that they freeze to threatening custody arrangements for single parents that were there.
Yeah.
Just every kind of underhanded uh, carrot and stick kind of tactic to try to get these people to go home. But if you understand the psychology of a person who views themselves as participating in a kind of historical event like that, you understand that those kinds of techniques reinforce their narrative, right?
Yeah. Trampling on an old woman is actually in the favor of your enemy if you're the one trampling the old woman.
Well, it certainly doesn't make them give up.
Yeah.
Um, and so, if you club them hard enough, hard power works, but their efforts to use soft power only works if it convinces your enemy. And convincing your enemy by reinforcing their narrative is not an effective strategy.
Mm-hmm. So how does Trudeau Jr. necessarily or not follow from Trudeau Sr.? Did I say that right? Trudeau
Yeah.
Jr. from Trudeau Sr. Like how
So
does the mindset that was in the 70s, the government of the 70s, impersoned in Trudeau follow to this theater kid?
Yeah. So Trudeau Sr. is a lot like many American progressives that are in political office today. Um, he is a figure who is aware of history and consciously putting it away, right?
Hmm.
Um, he is aware of, he's raised to believe marriage is sacred and becomes a swinger. Um, he's aware of Canada's history as a bicultural, like a political entity encompassing two nations, French Canadian and English Canadian, and consciously chooses to reframe that as a cultural mosaic encompassing many, many nations, paving the way for the post-national state, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's aware of those elements of history. He understands people who have those motivations. When Trudeau Sr. declares the war measure, invokes the War Measures Act and declares martial law in Quebec, he knows exactly the kind of narrative and world in which his opponents are living.
Mm-hmm.
He understands it and actively chooses not to live in it. The generational consequence of understanding understanding the transcendent, understanding a historical narrative, understanding though the ethnic and religious substructures that make up a people and choosing to ignore them, what is communicated to the next generation by that set of actions is that, especially if you win, is that those things don't really exist.
Yeah. You've completely delegitimized.
And so your descendants never become familiar with them. Right? So because you've actively chosen to forsake them, you never teach these things in your home in a serious way. You never communicate to the next generation that these things are fundamentally sacred even to other people and that they should have a relationship with them.
Be at least respectful, even if you don't agree with them.
Well, even just
respect that they have.
Understand that that's how 99% of people in all history everywhere have thought, and therefore you should understand it and understand how to manage. Understand that if you bring 5 million people from another nation here, they're gonna behave according to the old rules, not according to your rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how this is how generational attrition is. Well, one of the ways in which generational attrition is occurring in the Canadian elite, right? That failure to communicate generation to generation has led to a massive decline in both competence and motivation to achieve in a kind of gross sense.
Well, then what do they want? What's their vector of ambition? Is it, like you said, just cunning, just power for power's sake?
Yeah, it's just kleptocratic.
Of things?
It's just kind of kleptocratic.
Okay.
They're bequeathed these positions of power. They I don't know, Justin Trudeau likes to snowboard. He likes to see his face in the papers. And so, but that's all it is for them. It's not, I said this on my Twitter account at the time. So near the end of Justin Trudeau's political career, he announced that he was terminating the program, which allows 5 million temporary foreign workers and international students to stay in the country on visas. That he's going to revoke them. These people hypothetically have to go home over the next 2 years, assuming that nothing else is done. Justin Trudeau built his political career on being on the post-national state, the idea that Canada was open for that being a Canadian was no more significant than being a person anywhere else in the world, and anybody could become Canadian. Mm-hmm. To see him make that reversal demonstrated to me beyond any doubt that Justin Trudeau doesn't believe in anything.
Huh.
Right. Well, Justin Trudeau is that famous quote, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me." That's Justin Trudeau.
Okay. But he still believes, he believes in himself. So he's still that. So why would he revoke that? What was the calculus at that moment? Again, this is like Memento Man. It's like, okay, liberalism. Okay, well, nationalism over here. I'll remember that one and construct a new.
Well, so this is near the end of his political career. He sees his coalition fracturing under his feet. His only path is to try to redevelop enough personal popularity in order to in order to get his party back into line and stay in power. Okay. So he does the thing that he knows will be popular. So he knows that in Canada there's this tremendous backlash against the migrants that he brought. So he says, okay, well, they don't vote, I'll send them all back. and it didn't work, but that was the thinking behind it.
Is it still going through, or is it going to be rescinded?
Well, we're in a moment of, I mean, this is kind of interesting in its own right. So Justin Trudeau resigned as not as prime minister, but as leader of his own party. And then he went to the governor general, which is an office related to the monarchy, and got parliament suspended for a period of 3 months so that a leadership race can take place in the Liberal Party. Theoretically, the idea is that then the Liberal Party will be able to face the polls with a new leader, I guess.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But in the
Because
interim,
he thinks everybody's as short-sighted as he is.
I guess. I mean, if you look at Trudeau Sr. exited power after the crisis in Quebec and then re-entered power as prime minister 4 years later. And so I'm sure that in Trudeau world, he's thinking the Liberal Party will anoint a sacrificial lamb, he'll lose, the Conservatives will come in, and then I will ride in as Sunny Ways Trudeau again 4 years from now.
Really?
And here's a nice bomb for the Conservative Party. They're going to have to be the ones to actually deport all these people, and they're going to be the ones to deal with the deficit problem and all this other crap. And I'll let them do the hard part and then blame them when they're unpopular. That's kind of his thinking for how he's going to get back into power.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we have a prime minister but no parliament, and the prime minister doesn't really have very much legitimacy because he's resigned as leader of his own party because of his own unpopularity. And we have really substantial issues facing the country and nobody who's in a position to address them in any meaningful way. We have, a sort of Damocles dangling over the Canadian economy in the form of Trump's proposed tariffs that would do immense damage to the country if implemented. But there's no person with which Trump can even credibly negotiate with in Canada. So,
would there be a silver lining to that if Trump went through with those tariffs and Canada suffers? Would there be a wake-up call?
Well, a wake-up call to what? Right? Trump's theoretical rationale in applying these tariffs and destroying the Canadian economy is border security somehow. But like, the actual reality at the border between Canada and the United States is that most of the problems are related to drug trafficking from the United States to Canada, not the other way around. Trump may be looking forward to a future date where if these temporary foreign workers are supposed to eventually be deported, they may attempt to become illegals in the U.S. rather than illegals in Canada. But that hasn't happened yet. It's certainly not necessarily the case that it will happen. I mean, if you apply a severe tariff to Canada and damage the economy and create a large underclass of people who are suffering economically, you might well create the border crisis that you're trying to avert. So I don't think that this is a very well thought through policy. I think it is much more for domestic consumption in the US than it is like a serious I assume what he was hoping to get was a Canadian politician to kind of genuflect and give him some concessions, then he'd move on. But there's no Canadian politician in a position to do that. So like, what do you do? There's nobody to offer a sword and surrender.
Weird. So your government is just kind of, the engine's shut off and it's just kind of gliding right now.
Yes. And it's gliding at a point where there's traffic on the road, right?
Yeah. Wow. So Trump did get elected. He just got into power now. Things are he issued all these executive orders. A lot of people in the conservative or in the anti-progressive or progressive skeptical camps are applauding, yay, man and woman mean something to this entity that controls, all this
Yeah.
power over my
Yeah.
life. But it also seems, so I'm kind of skeptical what an EO actually does. I'm kind of skeptical. I'm a wait and see kind of guy with Trump.
Yeah.
But there's, from my point of view, an obvious feeling that which is called wokeness, or was called wokeness, in its classical form. Not this woke right baloney. That's another topic.
Yeah.
Classical wokeness is kind of done. The progressives are kind of out of favor. They're crestfallen. I mean, Reddit is a hotbed of radicalization still, but I don't see power really adoring wokeness anymore. There's a change of attitude.
Yeah.
It seems like right now. Maybe they're just licking their wounds and they'll come back and tenfold in a few months or a couple of years. But how do you think that ideological pivot that might be happening in the United States might affect Canada's elite? Do you think that the Canadian elite are as willing to wash their hands of DEI, let's say, and multiculturalism and all these other hyper liberal ideals as the American elite seem to be ready to do?
That's an interesting question. Typically, the Canadian elite are behind the American elite in this process. So when neoconservatism conquered the U.S. government in the post 9/11 era, it was another 4 or 5 years before neoconservatism made its effort to conquer the Canadian government. It never fully conquered the Canadian government,
Yeah.
but the Canadian government is never as ideological as the U.S. government is. Um, I think, contrary to what people might think, the Canadian government is more effectively woke than the U.S. government, but less actually woke. So what I mean by this is, if you took a metric like how many children has the Canadian government successfully transitioned, I'm sure they're doing better on a per capita basis than the U.S. government.
Because
They're much more
efficient,
they're much more efficient at implementing that kind of stuff. But if you were to take the metric and say how many DEI lectures were delivered in Canada on a per capita basis, you would find that the U.S. oligarchy is vastly more efficient at delivering ideological training, and vastly more efficient at patronizing ideological. Like, there are way more progressive, professional progressives in the United States than there are in Canada.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's almost easier for the Canadian elite to get to dispose of this. If they do, it'll take longer. But one of the problems that the Canadian elite is facing actual real problems that it's going to have to deal with, whereas the American elite, whatever you want to say about the United States, it has tremendous economic and military resources. It doesn't really have, its real problems that it has to deal with is it has to deal with domestic dissent, and it has to buy people back into the system. But it doesn't really have, there's no serious secession movement in the United States. There's no threat that the economy is going to collapse. There's none of the systems. As long as you kind of keep people kind of bought in, the United States government can keep going for, I don't know how long, quite a while. Whereas if you don't make fundamental changes in Canada, the Canadian government is just going to, Canada's just going to cease to exist pretty soon.
Really? What, are we talking 20 years?
Yeah, within the 20-year time horizon.
Yeah.
Unless you make successful reforms, Canada as we know it will not exist. So, the entire university system has been repurposed as a giant visa for cash scheme. That can't go on forever. You've got this giant real estate bubble that's predicated on bringing, like, if you shut down the immigration thing, then the real estate bubble has a then the real estate situation has a problem, which means you're going to have like a serious financial crisis in Canada. So you can't stop the immigration train, but the immigrants have to be wealthy enough in order to be able to afford the houses. Otherwise, that breaks. So there are real structural issues that have to be addressed in order for the country to like keep running. And unlike in the United States, where if you create an underclass that are poor, they just kind of, there's been a large homeless underclass of drug addicted people in California for a long time, and nothing really bad happens. Lots of them die, but they don't act collectively. It's really, really hard to be part of the urban poor in Canada. These people are going to be extremely motivated to do something. So I just don't believe that you can go on running Canada with its present ideological commitments for very long. So in some ways, I think there's a lot more pressure to put the woke away here. But coupled with, and a lot more tools, because you've got sovereignty basically contained in the government. On the other hand, Canada seems like it's slow on the uptake. Like there's nobody prepared to step in and do something about it, and act to the degree that would be required to get things back on course.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Like, is there the possibility even of a great man, a Caesar, somebody who could unify and correct things, take the blows and trump their way through it?
Well, so Pierre Poilievre is running on an implicit political platform to take Canada from being a client state of blue America and make Canada a client state of red America, right? Which means replacing blue American values with red American values in Canadian institutions. Race-blind meritocracy. Canada is an idea similar to the American idea, and that idea might be freedom and whatever, but it's also pump as much oil out of the ground as humanly possible, right? Yeah. That's Pierre Poilievre. Yeah. That will solve quite a few of Canada's problems, but Canada has a number of structural problems that cannot be addressed that way, right? Canada has Quebec separatism, which cannot be addressed that way. In fact, if you try to walk in that direction, you're going to run straight into the kind of ethno-narcissism of French Canada. It also has the entire university system that if you pursue that policy, like at least a third of Canadian universities are going to have to go out of business. And
where you put those workers?
Well,
workers.
You have a whole pile of like professional progressives who are very motivated to undermine your project at the very least.
Yeah.
And so you've got some problems, some obstacles to success there, and I don't have a very high view of his competence to address them. Maybe, but I think I think he will be unable to overcome Quebec separatism as a problem for himself, and I think he'll be unable to figure out what to do with the immigration problem.
Okay. What do the Quebecois have that gives them a bargaining chip?
So the settlement after Trudeau Sr.'s mishap was to make huge swaths of both corporate and the Canadian government bureaucracy positions that require you to be bilingual in French and English, which amounts to a vast patronage scheme for French Canadians, because they're the only people. Well, they're the only large population that can qualify, and so French Canada has
The professional
disproportionate,
managerial classes,
yeah, it
their
has
contribution.
disproportionate control of the federal bureaucracy,
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
and disproportionate control of the court system. You also
Hmm.
Quebec has a separate civil law, so in order to practice as a lawyer in Quebec, you have to be qualified in Quebec civil law as well as in the common law descended legal system of the rest of the country, which
Hmm.
means that in practice, almost all judges and lawyers in Quebec are Quebecois. So this kind of control of the infrastructure in that part of the country
Hmm.
is their bargaining chip.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, but if it came down to an ultimatum, what would they do? If somebody was
Well,
serious, like, we don't care about you, go your own way, we're fine. Like, what would the damage be?
well,
Like,
the
you can,
damage would be that the Laurentian elite would never be in power in the country again, right? Because a large element of the Laurentian the province of Quebec is split in power, maybe 70-30, the Quebecois elite and the Laurentian elite. That 30% of power coming out of Quebec puts the Laurentian elite over the top in their contest versus the Western Canadian elite.
yeah.
So if Quebec separatism actually happens, forget what forgetting the immediate consequences, there's segments of the nation that'll be cut off, and who knows what happens to them. Uh, you would put yourself into a position where the Western elite would permanently have the whip hand over the Laurentian elite.
How would that be a bad thing?
Well, the country is controlled by the Laurentian elite. They're not going to make decisions that cause them to be
Yeah.
in a
Hmm.
position where they're a subdominant elite group within the country.
Well, the problem is that if they are continually generationally incompetent, then plus they are not replacing themselves
Well,
biologically,
so
then
if your question is, would this be a good thing for the people of Canada? Sure,
yeah.
um, but it's very. Would this be a good thing? What you're talking about is there a future where the Laurentian elite cease to be the key power block in the country? And the answer to that is yes. The question is, what are all the accompanying political changes going to be?
Yeah.
Uh, and whatever they are, and there's a couple of different futures that
Hmm.
could come, whatever they are, they involve the permanent political reorganization of the country.
That is a good question to explore then. What would that orientation be? So Dimes, when I interviewed him, it seems like he was angling toward an ethno genesis type of thing, or around some sort of either tighter or looser definition of white identity or Canadian
Yeah.
white identity, ethnic identity. I don't know how many legs that has, but that's one orientation that has worked
Yeah.
pre-modern times. I don't know if that works in postmodern times with
Well, I
any
mean,
like long-term
there's
stability.
layers to this, right?
Yeah.
In Quebec is probably the last genuine ethno state that exists in the Western world. It
Israel
is
doesn't count.
well, okay. I'm excluding Israel from the Western
Okay, but
world for the moment.
okay, but that would be similar to Israel, just for
Similar
a
to Israel,
conceptual.
yes.
Okay, all right.
Except Israel, the ethnic population for whose benefit the state is managed, constitute a minority of the population in Israel's current territories.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas in Quebec, French Canadians constitute a supermajority of the
Okay,
population.
they have leverage still. Okay, cool.
So they're a supermajority of the elite that dominate the political bloc, the, the, the province, and they're a supermajority of the population. So
Yeah,
it's a classic ethno state in the European sense, except that it's not an independent ethno state.
yeah.
Um, so that's one possible part of a future for Canada, but the future for the rest of the country is very much unwritten at this point. And there is a tremendous political opportunity that exists to fill that to fill in that blank page. That opportunity at present is constrained by the relationship between Canada and the United States. So the only political solutions which are viable in Canada in the immediate future are political solutions that are also acceptable to the dominant governing party in the United States. Which means that breaking up into a Quebec ethno-state and some kind of ethnically oriented Western Canadian republic or something, that's not a solution that's going to be acceptable to the current powers that be in the United States. At the point of crisis, who knows whether that's acceptable or not. But I think given the state of play in the United States, and given that we're talking about a political crisis that is kind of slow rolling over the next 15 years, I think it would be irresponsible to do more to even speculate what that future could be, except that future will be a Canada not dominated by the Laurentian elite that has historically dominated it. And so, when you're in a bad situation, if you roll the dice, maybe you do better. I don't know, but that's kind of the way I view. That's kind of the way I view it. The Western Canadian elite at present are making noises like the solution for them is to develop a political formula based on the relationship between Red America and the Red American elite.
Drill baby drill, and then 90s kind of center right-ishness.
Yeah. And that's a solution that, if I had to make a bet on what Canada will look like 15 years from now, that's the bet I would make, but I would not make that bet at more than like a 60% confidence level.
I think this episode and the Dimes episode really dovetail quite sweetly, in that the Dimes episode's more related, I think, more to the perspective of the common man, the common Canadian man, or the commoner of the Canada, to what's been going on from the elite. And what you've kind of detailed, or at least given me a precise on, is the elite kind of structure and the point of view of the elites. But underlying both conversations is this question: what is a Canadian? And it's not a simple question to solve, because you have these kind of East Coast-ish people, the Western territories, and then the Quebecois. Where do you want to put your value in yourself as a Canadian? And you don't have to be specific. I don't mean to make that a personal question. I'm saying, where's the road for your folk, your people, your Canada, the Canada that you love, the Canadians that you love? Where do they go?
Yeah, so I'm the descendant of a culture which is dying. And out of that have emerged a couple of subcultures that have the will to live, right? So I personally live my life in a tiny little bubble that I call the Reform community in southwestern Ontario. The total population of this subculture is probably less than 200,000 people. Tiny little community. But a community that is like a high trust closed community that has a vision for itself and its future within a broader context. What I see in Canada broadly is this disintegration, right? There's a large body of people who are kind of left behind as the mainstream culture has evaporated. A lot of these people just, like, they don't have the will to carry on anymore. They're just kind of putting in time. And that's where I would put like 65% of the Canadian population is in that
Really?
category,
You think
where they're
that
just,
the demoralization is spread that far?
yeah, they don't have, there's a reason Canada has a birth rate of like 1.3. Um,
Yeah.
they just don't care, right? They
Yeah.
don't see a future for themselves. They're people. They don't have a they're all the last man.
Yeah.
Um, and my view is that the future for Canada is going to be written in these very small segments of the population that have a will to live.
Hmm.
And it's just going to be an endurance contest
Yeah.
as the broad culture falls apart and as the economy falls apart. Uh, who's going to, like, Canada's an innately hostile environment.
Yeah.
Uh, you have to, it requires a degree of just raw will to stay here and make a life out of it. I'm the descendant of loyalists. When they came to this part of Canada, they had all of their property in the United States confiscated and were badly mistreated by the Americans.
Really?
Um, well, yeah, that's how English Canada got its start, right?
Okay.
So English Canada was so the what were called the Tories during the Revolutionary period in the United States were driven from their homes and had their property seized. Many of them were brutally murdered during the Revolutionary War. Those that survived were resettled by the British in two parts of Canada. One, what was then called Acadia, now Atlantic Canada, and the other, what is now called Ontario, um, which was a plot of uh, complete wilderness,
Yeah.
um, owned by the Massasauga tribe, and the British government made a one-time payment to the Massasauga tribe to buy a big stretch of land on the north side of Lake Ontario that the loyalists were resettled in and proceeded to turn a vacant from a vacant wilderness into a little England, right?
Hmm.
That's the legacy of the loyalists. That's where
Wow.
Anglo Canada came from.
Hmm.
Um, but that project only occurred in one little like sliver of the country. It's a completely different legacy than most Canadians have.
Hmm.
Um, and not only that, it's not like a repeatable project. You can't, uh, because of the way that the political situation is in Canada, you can't repeat the project and have a new settlement for your new ethnogenesis.
Yeah.
You have to wait for the state to decay enough, uh, for things to get for them not to care enough to allow you to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you still have America peeking over your shoulder and probably more than willing to take advantage of any sort of deterioration. I mean, there is no more vacuum. There's no possibility of a political power vacuum because of modern technology and modern interests and stuff. We're all
Well,
woven
I mean,
together.
I think there's way more possibility of power vacuum than I think people presently imagine.
Yeah.
Uh, at the moment, the United States is uh, quite focused. I mean, they're still trying to live in the unipolar moment where they run the entire world.
Yeah.
Um, but for most of the U.S.'s history, uh, their interest in Canada has extended to, you know, make sure that they're not a military threat,
Yeah.
and you know, uh, maybe we want to buy your iron, and maybe we want to sell you our manufactured goods, and that's about it, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Throw in a couple pipelines and we're okay. Maybe
yeah.
that trans or that the northern Pacific when the ice melts. There's that northern
Oh, the Northwest Passage.
passage. Yeah.
Yeah, except we've been hearing about how that's going to exist for the last 30 years, and it still doesn't exist.
Okay.
So uh, I mean, uh, maybe I don't know, but it's entirely plausible. Like, the vast majority of Canada is completely unsettled at the moment.
Yeah.
Um, I don't see any political interest in settling it anytime in the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
So uh, in a world in which America becomes a little bit more insular, I see lots of potential for power vacuums, but
Yeah.
not today.
Yeah. I I went to Bible college in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan
Yeah.
in 1996, I think it was, for like 8 months. It was just this short little stint I had up there. So I've kind of experienced Canadians when I was rather young and still impressionable. And then since I started my little mom and pop YouTube shop, I've been interacting with Canadians a lot because the DEI stuff, the woke stuff, the anti-woke stuff, and then permutations that all these different developments in this story that I'm kind of just watching unfold. Canada has always been close to the people that I've spoken to, like on all these different vectors and stuff. So on an individual basis, there's a lot of very keen, smart, ambitious Canadians. I know that. You look at the political situation in Canada, because of the way that your governance is formed and then the way that sovereignty operates, you kind of see it as like this unchangeable thing that's going to decay. But I guess I see this in America too. You know, we have this big, huge government apparatus and all these problems, but there's all these individuals that are really competent and crafting something in their own domain and surviving any given apocalypse. I'm wondering, is there, I guess you mentioned it you're connected to a more or less insular, very small community that has a will to live. I'm wondering, is there, like,
There's
on a
lots of
media
them.
level, so there's a lot of them. And do you
Yes.
think that some sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, but some sort of connection between all these smaller communities unifying, maybe agitating, or at least is there like a circulation of the elites between all these different tribes?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that have to happen in order for, like, all of these little tribes are all deprived of their own elite because
Okay.
they have, up until fairly recently, gone through the same process that Red America has gone, where gone through, where you've had elite stripping
Yeah.
into in Canada. Actually, most of them leave the country and go to the U.S.
Yeah.
That process is completely broken down because of DEI. So when I was young, like 60-70% of the most talented people in religious communities would leave them and
Mm-hmm.
go and whatever they were doing, it wasn't leading their own communities.
Yeah.
Unless there's still some opportunity to go to the States, but in Canada, that opportunity has been almost entirely closed off because not only is there the kind of DEI sort of anti-white male apparatus to block you from entry to the institutions, but also there's extremely intense bigotry towards rural and particularly religious Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Canadian the Canadian mainstream is much more bigoted against Christians than it's possible to kind of envision as an American.
Really?
Um,
Huh.
well, because they don't have to deal with, like, even if you go to New York City, which is a very secular place, there are enough committed religious Christians there that you have to find a way
Pander
to
to them.
accommodate yourself
Or
with
accommodate,
them,
yeah,
right?
if not pander, yeah.
So you don't, like, if you go there on, like, I was recently in New York on Ash Wednesday, and there's people walking around with ashes. Ashes. It's a visible part of their culture.
Yeah.
Even in the most progressive, most blue cities. Whereas in Canada, it is completely expunged from any space
Mm-hmm.
that an elite would ever occupy.
Mm-hmm.
Or the only context in which you view it is as a legacy of settler colonialism and as pure evil.
Yeah.
Right. This is why you can have things like the church burnings in Canada,
And
because
nobody bats an eye.
in Canadian elite culture, that's not only acceptable but like a desirable expression of good progressivism.
Hmm.
Um, so because of that, we're experiencing what Spandrel called the base draft at a very aggressive rate, right? The elites of these communities are being forced to become elites of their own communities because they can't make their way in the broader culture.
Hmm.
Um, and it's very unclear to me where that process ends up
Wow.
in a world where the United States turns back into race blind meritocracy. Suddenly, there's all kinds of opportunities for these people to go to the United States, and you
Yeah.
may have round two of elite stripping, um, and it may completely collapse the whole project. I don't know,
Mm.
um, but
Hmm.
for the moment, you have pressure in these communities like I don't think has ever existed in Canadian history.
Hmm. That's a really interesting positive aspect of the DEI stuff, forcing
Yeah, yeah, it's
these
one of the
white
reasons
males to
why.
particularize.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I'm not. Um, I, I have a. I try to keep a kind of emotional distance from the Trump stuff because, um, first of all, I'm not an American, so it's not like it's a little bit less personal to me by
Hmm.
necessity. But also, I'm not a fan of the American empire as a force internationally, and uh, you have to celebrate Trump for the like when Trump let the January 6th prisoners out of jail. You have a moral obligation to celebrate the exercise of justice, right? The restoration of people who have been subject to injustice.
Hmm.
However, um, the more successful Trump is at um, getting the American empire back on its feet, the worse condition my personal project is going to be in,
Hmm.
uh, because it's going to take all of the pressure to stay in your community off.
Yeah.
And people have notoriously short memories for these things.
Yeah.
COVID was 2 years ago or whatever it was. And apart from the fact that uh, in Canada, certain urban areas are just will never have not recovered, everybody just goes on like it never happened.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's kind of a difficult. I don't have a consequentialist view of morality, so I don't take the view that. Uh, so I try to kind of just keep an emotional distance from it and not think think about doing right in the here and now.
Hmm.
But I'm not. Um, I'm not uh, blindly optimistic about the prospects for uh, parallel communities that are presently on the upswing in Canada.
Yeah. The consequences of COVID will rear themselves or come to light in the maturation of the generation most affected by them, which was the children, pubescent age kids who got shut out of schools, put online, and
Yeah,
subject to these tyrannical, fear-mongering, paranoid policies.
well, I mean, this is going to go on YouTube, so we have to
Yeah.
be a little bit conscious here. But I mean, Canada was a place subject to a very extreme form of this, and the number of people who I know personally whose lives will just never recover from that experience is quite high.
Hmm.
It reminds me when NAFTA was put into place in the early 90s, Canada had a bunch of people in industries that were marooned, right? These were industrial workers whose factories closed
Mm.
um, as a result of the trade agreement. And most of these people never recovered. Like most of this group were men in the prime of their earning years who had a particular set of skills related to the industry they were operating in. And many of them eventually did get reemployed, but never at a comparable level.
Yeah.
And there's a whole cohort that you can track through Canadian demographic history of people whose lives were just destroyed by this.
Wow.
And it caused Canadian unemployment to be structurally higher than the rest of the world for a period of about 15 years afterwards.
Wow.
And these people had problems with alcoholism. They had problems with, you can kind of track it all through.
Yeah.
The scale of that is nothing compared to the scale of what was done during COVID. And in my opinion, still is being done as a consequence of this ridiculous situation we backed into with regard to work from home, where, you know, many employees, particularly government employees, just never do any work, basically, as far as I can see. It turns out, like, people are, in a crude sense, kind of beasts of burden. If they don't do anything, they self-destruct, right?
Yeah.
And this, it's going to be a generational proposition to see how the consequences of all this unfold.
Yeah. Is there anger?
Yes. Yeah. Profound anger.
Will that anger translate into societal, cultural, or political action?
So that anger translated into Justin Trudeau never being able to announce his schedule, because anywhere he appeared, there'd be like crowds of horrendously angry people following him around, swearing at him, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it resulted in his personal political unviability, like as he attempted to sort of revitalize his image.
Yeah.
That project was impossible given the public dynamics.
Yeah. That's catharsis, though. That's not.
That's what I say. What happens now that he's gone, assuming he is gone, is less clear to me. There's a lot of Canadians who are deeply angry about this and deeply hurt by it. It's almost like a crisis of their progressive faith. When I talk about demoralization in the country, this is a huge element of it, right? These people were progressive religious believers from birth. They went through the public education system and so on. And then that progressive faith, their God failed them.
Yeah.
And now they just kind of exist.
Well, you lose faith in good governance, and then you watch the erosion of your prosperity, and then the last pillar is going to be the peace.
Yes. So I'm not sure exactly how all of that takes shape. Mm-hmm. Canada has a more violent political history than I think Americans appreciate.
We have a distant memory of you burning our White House at some point. That's about
yes, but during the First World War, we opened fire with machine guns on our own people over conscription. There's
well, that's the government doing it. Have the people uprised? Other than having a bouncy house in the middle of Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, in the 70s, they kidnapped some MPs and murdered them.
Oh, okay.
So there's some history of it, mostly on the far left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an Anglo society, which meant that in the before times, it was a martial society where the martial class led. Right. If you go through small town Ontario, you'll still see these like echoes of it in pipe bands parading through the streets in military uniforms. Right. This is 19th century Anglo society was led by the warrior caste and honored it. And Canada retains that echo in its culture, but it's very faint. It's very
Hmm.
It's not. I mean, it still is the case that all through small town Canada, the Royal Canadian Legion is the center of culture for most Canadians.
Hmm.
Um, but it's very decayed, and I, as much as I'm somewhat circumspect on the prospect of parallelism for these small communities, I'm an outright doomer for mainstream Canadian culture. I think if you're someone like, I don't want to pick on Dimes, but he's a member of mainstream Canadian working class culture, those people are screwed.
Hmm. Yeah, that's what
Um,
came up. What binds you guys? Molson Ice and Tim Hortons was what we
yeah,
kept on coming up with.
it's like Canadian working class culture is very hollowed out, and they got very bad political leadership. And you talked about his hope of kind of white Canadian identity politics. I mean, maybe it'd be good if it happened, but it's not in the immediate. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a long way to go between here and there.
Yeah.
So, and if it did happen, I don't like assume that it was magicked into existence.
Hmm.
Then you would, instead of just having the Battle of Brampton between the Sikhs and the Hindus every year, you'd have a few more battles.
Canadian blood sports.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I like there's a it's not a pretty picture for those people, and I don't know how they get out of it. I
Yeah.
don't think the crisis of faith in progressivism is really recoverable. I think
Hmm.
I think that religion is just dead.
Hmm.
Um,
And what follows? Have we been at the end of this particular history? Do we know what's next with the progressive logic
well, I think the progressive
dialectic?
elite will just kill themselves, uh,
Yeah.
very much like the Roman elite before them, and
Yeah.
like the French royalist elite, and
Hmm.
many aristocratic classes have killed themselves in the past. Um, either just by atrophy or by
Yeah.
slamming themselves into another force. Um, I think what happens afterwards is fracture. You get a lot of small competing interests trying to take the
Yeah.
reins in the shadow of probably some kind of governance apparatus that's supervised by the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we got your back. What does Black Horse mean?
So when I created this account on Twitter, I created it in like this iteration was 2020, and I created it to be a utility account cataloging the post-COVID inflation that was
Oh,
obviously coming for anyone who was
yeah.
paying attention. The black horse is the third horseman of the apocalypse, the horseman which accompanies famine and inflation.
Okay.
And so I chose that avatar in order to become a utility account to catalog inflation. That took longer to materialize than I thought it would. And
Hmm.
um, ultimately, I discovered that being a utility account on Twitter was something that kind of died with the change in Meta
Hmm.
in 2020. So if you look back at like Twitter from 2014 to 2019, there are all these great like single issue accounts.
Yeah.
Um, I used to follow a guy. What was he called? The account was Tyndale Tweeteth after William Tyndale, and
Hmm.
all it did all day was tweet out facts about William Tyndale.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and you could like have engagement tweeting like 3 times a month about William Tyndale.
Yeah.
But that's impossible now.
Try it
Um,
out.
so uh, as a consequence of the changes in the platform and as a consequence of my low impulse control in not replying to people, I ended up building a very different account.
Where would you say you are? Do you have like a kind of a political identity or political signifier?
Uh, I mean, I would count myself as part of the realist right. Um,
Hmm.
I believe very forcefully in value-free analysis as an effective tool.
Mm-hmm.
Most of what I do in the space is value-free analysis that is not laden with a political indication. I have my show periodically with Stephen Carson, where we call it Econ Minis. We look at stuff that is happening that's not being
Mm-hmm.
discussed. Um, I have I'm on the right because I believe that people are defined overwhelmingly by their involuntary commitments. Um,
Hmm.
so I am defined by my involuntary commitment uh, to my people, my God, my land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I would say that I am also uh, I have a large constellation of interests that actually predate substantially my prominence on the e-right. So I followed dissident right politics going back to like 2014,
Mm-hmm.
because I was interested in elite theory, because I was interested in, I mean, you can't be a student of Canadian political history and believe in democracy in politics. It's not
Hmm.
possible.
Hmm.
You have to be like completely. Um, it, there's a periodic interlocutor of Dave Green, Matt McManus, who's a professor at I think the University of Ottawa,
Yeah.
and the level of like not viewing clearly Canadian history required to behave that way is just it's beyond me. So I've never been able to be uh, to kind of participate in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've always, for a long period of time, I believed that the only thing of political significance, the only significant political things for me were I work in the financial industry, so deeply understanding the future of politics is important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, B, I believed quite strongly in parallelism, building institutions in my own community,
Yeah.
which is something that we've done extremely well as a community, well enough to attract some pushback from the Canadian state.
Oh, there we are. You're on some radars.
Well, so there's a very famous case that uh, is worth looking into. The Trinity Western University is a Christian university in Canada that tried to open a law school and got into a years-long fight with the Law Society of Ontario because its code of conduct required its faculty and students to I think it is either formally confine or only sanction sexual activity within the confines of a heterosexual marriage,
Mm-hmm.
um, which the Law Society of Ontario deemed um, an unsuitable code of conduct for any society offering a legal education.
Interesting. Wow.
And so the case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and eventually Trinity Western University was compelled to alter its code of conduct to conform to progressive pieties in order to form the law school. But this kind of thing between parallel institutions in uh, the a couple religious subcultures in Canada and the Canadian state has been going on for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've participated in my capacity in real life in this effort in various ways. Um, 2020 really changed my perspective as to what is possible in Canada. It really broke my belief that it was previously my view that the kind of liberal presuppositions of the Canadian state would prevent them from cracking down hard on communities like ours.
Mm-hmm.
And then they arrested pastors who I know,
Yeah.
um, right? Uh, you know, that'll change your perspective a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I was younger, I thought about going into the ministry there, but for the grace of God, go I. Like,
Mm.
if I had a different career path, I could have been joining them
Well,
for 40
yeah.
days in prison if I was
Yeah.
if I was worthy of the task. Um,
Hmm.
and since observing that reality, I have been struggling with how to re-articulate a political vision. So the first thing that I did is I got engaged with people who I believed had a grasp on politics as it actually is, not politics as it should be, and kind of provided value to that community in doing value-free analysis where I had
Hmm.
real expertise,
Yeah.
hoping that out of looking at the situation deeply, I would come to greater wisdom as to how to forge a future for my own community.
Hmm.
The result of that has been um, parallelism is probably the best we got, um, but it probably won't work.
Hmm.
Um,
Why not? Because they can't leave you alone?
yeah.
And why
So
can't they leave you alone? Is this
as
about?
long as the American empire with its presuppositions exists, it's going to want to break down all these subordinate regional structures of power, right? It's the logic of empire. No different than Rome went through this had this digestion process down to a science. They fought rebellions in Spain for 100 years until they eventually pacified it.
Hmm.
Um, the logic of empire is to try to crush all these little regional nodes of power. If you're in a situation where you're trying to assemble a community with values contradict the values of the imperial throne, it's a very bad position to be in. You basically just have to generationally outlast the imperial throne in order to have a
Mm.
future.
Hmm.
Um, which has, I think there's quite good prospects that my community might do that, but uh, the broader my broader ethnic community in Canada has no chance of it, or very
Yeah.
little
Well, they
chance of
can't
it.
send you guys to. Well, it's too cost prohibitive on a number of different vectors to send your children to residential schools, but they can strip your elites out by promising them wealth and status elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah, and like if there's lots of stuff they can do, and uh, the American empire is in decline, but
Yeah.
it's not like it's going to fall tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So it's a question of endurance, and so um, my
Hmm.
politics are the survival of my people. And
Hmm.
then I have a large constellation of these kind of value-free analysis projects that I'm involved in that are fascinating, but they're not actually politics, right?
Hmm.
Um, I have engaged repeatedly with the pronatalist people because I think it's fascinating. I think it's good for the people who engage in it. I think there's lots to be brought to it in a value-free way, but I don't care if their project succeeds. Like, I mean, I care in kind of the most general way that I'd like to see other people thrive, but
Hmm.
like uh,
Hmm.
the fact that the fact that South Korea is going through like an extinction level demographic transition, you know, okay.
Hmm.
Um, I
Hmm.
don't think it's a good thing, but it's not. I'm not politically invested in it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you brought up like what makes you right wing is the involuntary commitments that you have or that people have, which you
It's
said your
that,
people, your God, and your land. Yeah.
yeah, it's that I think those are the things that define a man and define a good man,
Yeah. Those
right?
those are really close to a leftist conception of identities being that which define you. But there seems to be a moral or value content to identitarianism, as you it could be construed that you're talking
Yeah,
about identity. You're talking about a
yeah,
people,
absolutely.
a land, a God,
Yeah,
and at least an articulation of the good and God that is particular to a people. to a language, to an ethnos. And then you have the leftist, progressive, woke doctrine of intersectionality and identity and people being distilled into identities, and then the rubric of conflict theory.
Yeah. But
Being
the
posed on
basic
those.
difference is that all those leftists believe that they choose their identity, right? They socially
Ah,
construct them,
okay. Yeah.
right? Whereas I didn't choose, none of those identities, I think, are voluntary value neutral choices, right?
Would that include sexuality, something like the sexual identity or sexuality identity?
I
You
mean,
didn't choose that?
I'm committed to the Christian view of sexuality where your sexuality is not an identity, it's choice of a choice of
It's a
actions,
behavior. Okay. But
right?
those who you have descended from are not, they are an identity because there's no choice there. It's a pre-commitment.
That's right. So your descendants going forward and backwards in time are an obligation given to you by God, right? You have no morally acceptable choice not to be committed to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? The choice to not be fruitful and increase in numbers is a violation of God's law. The choice
Mm-hmm.
not to honor your father, not to honor your long fathers, that's that's a morally unacceptable set of choices.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, to walk away from those commitments or to self-construct an identity the way that the left encourages people to self-construct an identity,
Yeah.
in my view, is the most repugnant of all things because it's taking what should be sacred and and attempting to construct it yourself as though you're um, like
God.
you're yeah, exactly. It's inserting yourself as the divine.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a third perspective, the liberal, classical liberal perspective that casts both identitarian groups into this horseshoe relationship, whereas the liberal is the sane one. Everybody else has cluster B. And does that track with you? Like there's this the centrist position that doesn't quite go as far identitarian wise as the leftist, but also deeply despises the right for its choice of commitments to
Yeah.
that which the right sees, or the traditional
Yeah.
right.
Okay. Let me make some comments here generally. So I don't view chosen identity and unchosen identity as similar, as meaningfully similar, right? So
Hmm.
I will use the example of um, the response to difficult circumstance or pressure, right? If you apply pressure and nudge people, you get changes in their chosen identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see this in all the chosen sexual identities that are proliferating, right? You nudge people, especially as children, they adopt chosen identities that you prefer they adopt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the pieces of your identity that are sacred are the things that you can't nudge people out of, particularly. You can't nudge people out of
You can
their
nudge
genetic.
people into rebellion against them.
Yes, you can, but uh, they're these things are different fundamentally
Hmm.
than the things that you can choose to pick up and choose to put down and not feel guilty about choosing to pick up and putting them down, right? So if you go down to, I don't know, the pro-Palestine march that's going on in some urban center today, because of course it is, you'll go and find people who have had a long list of identities that they've picked up and put down over the course of their life.
Okay.
And they will have no shame about having picked up and put them down, right? They'll think that that is the evolution of their thought as rational actors floating in the kind of floating in the ether, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas if you walk over to, I don't know, some conference of the authentic right that hypothetically exists somewhere, um, there will be an element of people there who are coming out of the broad culture and just kind of grasping at something. And in that respect, they're very similar to the left, right? These are people who didn't have an identity, who are attempting to construct one and attempting to leverage their constructed identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that respect, the social phenomena that you see on right and left among a certain
influencer class.
Yeah, there's a similar kind of social phenomena going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not actually all that interested. I mean, I find if your identity has been adopted in this generation in order to escape the broad culture, I have great sympathy for you because you were bequeathed something that you couldn't use. But that's not the same thing as having an unchosen commitment, right? An unchosen particularist view of your people. And so that's one of the fundamental differences. There's a couple of other pieces of this view that I have. One which I think everyone will understand, and the other I think people, certainly my opponents, will not think is very legitimate. But the first is that I think the liberal identity is something that you can only participate in above a certain IQ threshold. So people who, the overwhelming majority of the global population is incapable of constructing their own values in a healthy and productive way. Mm-hmm. And so I think the classically liberal vision is unsuitable for governance. Of
the Lobelitarians and the atheists included.
Yeah, I just think it's unsuitable for governance of the vast majority of people. So that's the criticism that I think is very easy to kind of intellectually defend. Yeah. And then the third piece is, I'm an unapologetic Christian. I believe in the absolute law of God. And as a consequence of the absolute law of God, I'm right and they're wrong. Right? So I don't believe that you can just, that it's a morally neutral question whether you just abandon your commitment to your forefathers. I don't believe that you just get to choose about the way you conduct yourself sexually. I don't believe that you just get to choose to not have children and extinguish your line. I believe you have affirmative moral imperatives that you must obey. And that is a set of beliefs that's completely incompatible with the classical liberal vision.
What do you? This is a bad question because you're very humble insofar as you choose repeatedly in this conversation not to do too much projection or fortune telling. But what is the outcome of the classical liberal?
Well, I think he just loses politically over time. He is the ideology of, like, classical liberalism is an ideology tailor-made to govern a large multi-ethnic empire, right? It is designed to dissolve the particularist commitments of all the people that you're governing over, which is why it's the ideology favored by the American ruling class. Yeah. Right. If you look at all the people,
as long as they can keep it in check, they love it.
Yeah,
when it turns into wokeness, they say, "Oh, that had nothing to do with this."
Yeah, but the classical liberal stuff, this is all good. This is all good. It breaks down all the kind of particularist elements, the people they're governing over. It gives them a kind of sense of freedom. You can kind of, it makes it easy to govern them as a large empire. So I understand exactly why these people have such institutional support, and I understand why. If you could hypothetically have classical liberalism forever, then maybe
you wouldn't mind that to be the context in which your particular tribe trades with other particular tribes.
Well, at a basic level, that will deliver to you relative peace for the days that it lasts.
Okay,
but it is the fate of all universalist kind of, these people are unequipped for the world that's coming, is my basic view.
Unequipped.
So if you fast forward, if you imagine right now that you're living in 200 AD, you could be a very good classical liberal in 200 AD, right? The world is full of people who worship all kinds of different pagan gods, and you know, as long as they acknowledge the emperor, everything's fine. But classical liberalism does not nobody dies for classical liberalism, right? Nobody suffers for classical liberalism. Nobody believes in the classical liberal dream.
Some people will throw their reputation into the shredder for classical liberalism, but
yeah, but probably not if they weren't paid to do it. Right. So if you look at the people who have done that, there's been very good money in being a professional classical liberal the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And so, you know, maybe you'll make embarrassing arguments in order to defend that position. Fine, whatever. But making embarrassing arguments as an epiphenomena of like a professional online influencer, that's a long way from the kinds of things that you have to do outside the Pax Romana, right? So when the long period of peace and safety breaks down, and you have to ask people, there's no classical liberalism in Ukraine right now. Right? There just isn't. It's not an ideology that can defend itself. And as long as the remnants of the kind of the Anglo-Protestant world existed to defend the American empire, that was fine. But they're dying very fast. And maybe Trump can arrest that decline for a period. Maybe a similar phenomena can arrest that decline. I don't believe you can reverse that decline without, I mean, the ways to reverse that decline also collapse the empire, right? Because you have to tell people to believe in a particular thing again.
Yeah.
And you get one group to buy in, the other groups buy out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I bring up quite often the so-called woman question when we talk about the the certain thinkers on the right proposing these different solutions. I'm like, well, how are you going to get women to buy into this? Because they're the ones who produce the children, and they've been freed, liberated from that role. And so how would you make the argument for that? But that's just the litmus test for a variety of things that men would be asked to do too. There's tons of sacrifice that you're asking, and it's really difficult to ask people to sacrifice if, as long as they get their biscuit and their circus, they're not going to sacrifice that much to the extent that actually, I mean, up to and including fighting and dying for a cause. And there's a lot of steps even before that, a lot of sacrifices that people aren't willing to do before that ultimate sacrifice.
That's right. Nobody is I mean, if you can't convince people to have a second child to defend the empire, how are you going to convince them to I have 4 children. It's not like my grandfather fought for 7 years in Europe during the World War. These are not comparable sacrifices, right? And and he got to fight on the winning side. You might have to ask people to fight on the losing side, which is much worse. So to me, classical liberalism is this kind of epiphenomena of peace and safety, and it's not worth intellectually addressing because it doesn't. I mean, the arguments they're making just aren't survivable. They don't survive contact with reality.
In the context of reality that you see shaping.
Well, so in the context of reality outside these short little historical bubbles, right? There have been a number of short historical bubbles where you could be a classical liberal.
Yeah.
Right. But they universally survive as long as the legacy particularist culture is willing to defend them. So my biggest concern out of all this is that as the legacy particulars culture in America falls, like we have this global system built on top of peace and order that supports, I don't know, like 7.5 billion people or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if you have a collapse of trade at the level of what happened during the First World War as the British Empire started to kind of come apart, an unfathomable number of people are going to die at the end of this.
There, but for the grace of God,
Well,
quote you.
I don't think we're going to, I don't think you and I, maybe at the end of our life, we'll see this, but
Yeah.
not in the immediate future.
Yeah.
Our generation is a transitional generation. Our task is to survive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to establish the necessary structures, values, and habits of survival for those who we care for.
There's this great quote from one of the two villains of the Braveheart movie, right? Braveheart sets up with Robert the Bruce as like the stand-in, and he's got two villains. He's got the King of England and his father, the previous Earl of Bruce, who's like a diseased leper, so that you know extra well you're supposed to hate him.
Mm-hmm.
And he says something like 14 generations of Robert Bruces have survived and passed you land and title, and they did it by not rushing in and by responsibly managing their title and by not becoming swept up in Scottish nationalism effectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is supposed to be your villain, but in reality every argument he makes is correct historically, right? The elite class that eventually liberated Scotland from English domination at the time survived under extremely difficult circumstances until there was a weaker English king, and then liberated the Scottish territories that were under English domination.
Mm-hmm.
This is a normal historical pattern that you're living through. It just doesn't feel like it from the inside.
Do you mean it feels like the exception rather than?
Well, modernity, the scale of modernity is such that it's easy to kind of lose sight of your place in history, right? Because the American empire is so close to establishing itself. It got so close to being a true global hegemon, and it got so close to establishing, the Reich that endures for 1,000,000 years or whatever, right? It's easy to forget that that didn't happen, right? History didn't actually end the way it was supposed to. The project to integrate Russia, the project to integrate China, the project to integrate India all failed.
Yeah.
And
But it succeeded, ironically, in certain respects, with the people that it was closest to by creating the end of history and the last man for a small couple generations. And that's who we see reflected.
And that's who we see in our elite class at the moment. And it's we just kind of have to live through it. And unfortunately, a lot of things are going to pass away on the way through, and I'm not sure what all of them are, but that's the way it is.
Black Horse, I had a feeling about you, and you delivered. Very happy to have you on my show. Where can people find you, and what are they going to find when they get there?
So you can follow my Twitter. All of my content is linked there. I view myself as a contributor to the online discussion, much as I view you as an entomologist of the online discussion rather than a contributor.
I remember you said something really nice to me about me, actually.
I wasn't sure how you were going to react to this, but my view of you is that you're like a curator of the online discussion. You're not actually, you don't make arguments. You just kind of collect them and put them on display. Like some kind of 19th century bug collector.
Yeah, I got all my butterflies in my little playlist.
Yes.
People can find below.
And it's, on the other hand, I view myself as kind of as a contributor to other people's projects.
Hmm.
You identified one of my buddies in Academic Agent who I made a project out of becoming a contributor to.
Mm.
You'll see my videos there from time to time, but there are a
Yeah.
number of other people. You'll see me on the Jay Burden show from time to time. And
Burden's great.
yeah, he's a very he's very good at collecting interesting guests.
Hmm.
And it's great to kind of have a bunch of these shows that showcase all the kind of all the currents in the intellectual firmament that we kind of operate in. It's very interesting.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I think it's, yeah. There's cross pollinations, and plus people get pilled. I don't know what color, but pills abound.
well, one of the things that I think about the distance space is I think it needs curation, and I think a lot of intellectually marginal people are kind of a bit overexposed, which is why I try not to.
Oh.
I don't release a Substack every month.
Hmm.
I release a Substack when I have something to say.
Yeah.
I don't release a video every week. I release a video when I have something to say.
Yeah.
So that's me. I hope your listeners find something of value there.
Absolutely. I know I did. So I'm going to end the recording. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you guys get some nice weather eventually soon. Cool, man. Thanks a lot.